A young black boy walks into class holding flowers, a heartfelt gesture of kindness. But when his teacher's cruel, racist response shatters the moment, what happens next will leave everyone stunned. It was the first day of spring, and the warm sunlight bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow. 8-year-old Marcus stood in front of the small flower shop, staring intently at the colorful array of blooms through the window. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he finally spotted the perfect bouquet. Delicate daisies mixed with vibrant tulips, their colors bursting like the joy in his heart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of crumpled dollar bills and coins. It was all his savings, carefully set aside from helping his mom clean up around their apartment building. With a wide grin, Marcus pushed open the shop door, the tiny bell jingling above him. "Can I buy these flowers, Mom?" Marcus asked shyly, placing his money on the counter. The older woman behind the counter smiled kindly. "These are for someone special, huh?" "Yes, Mom." Marcus nodded, his voice brimming with pride. "For my teacher, Miss Adams. She's always so kind to me, and I want to say thank you." As he left the shop, clutching the bouquet tightly, Marcus felt a sense of happiness he couldn't quite explain. He imagined Miss Adams's smile when he handed her the flowers. She was the kind of teacher who made him feel seen, the one who always praised his efforts, even when others overlooked him. For a boy like Marcus, growing up in a low-income neighborhood where opportunities were rare, those moments of encouragement were everything. Walking into the school, Marcus held the flowers carefully, his tiny hands trembling with anticipation. His classmates noticed him immediately, their chatter filling the room as they eyed the bouquet. "Marcus brought flowers? What for?" one girl whispered, her curiosity growing. Another boy chimed in, "Probably trying to get extra credit or something." Marcus didn't care. He wasn't worried about what anyone thought. This wasn't about grades. It was about showing gratitude to someone who made a difference in his life. He spotted Miss Adams standing near her desk, her usual calm and patient demeanor putting him at ease. She wore her signature smile, which always seemed to light up the room. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward, his small frame straightening with determination. "Good morning, Miss Adams," he began, his voice steady but soft. I got these for you. Just to say thank you for being such a great teacher." The room fell silent, every pair of eyes now on Marcus as he held out the flowers. For a brief moment, his heart swelled with hope and pride. But then, something unexpected happened. Miss Adams froze, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the bouquet. The warmth that usually defined her presence seemed to vanish in an instant. Marcus waited, his arms extended, the flowers trembling slightly in his grasp. The silence felt suffocating, and Marcus's bright smile began to falter. Finally, Miss Adams spoke, her voice cold and clipped. "Marcus, what is this supposed to be?" Marcus blinked, confused by the harshness in her tone. "They're flowers, Miss Adams," he said quietly. "For you. To say thank you." She sighed loudly, snatching the bouquet from his hands. "Thank you? For what, Marcus? For doing what you're supposed to do? Paying attention in class? Turning in your homework?" Her words were sharp, each one cutting into Marcus like a blade. The class erupted into stunned whispers, and Marcus felt the weight of every stare pressing down on him. He tried to speak, to explain, but Miss Adams wasn't done. "You think this is appropriate?" she snapped, holding the flowers out as though they were something offensive. "Bringing these to class like some kind of show? Trying to get attention? This isn't a place for your little stunts." Marcus's heart sank, his cheeks burning with shame. He opened his mouth to protest, but the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. Before he could react, Miss Adams did something that made the entire room gasp. She crushed the flowers in her hands, the delicate petals crumpling beneath her grip. Without a second thought, she tossed them into the trash can by her desk. "This isn't a circus, Marcus," she said, her tone icy. "Focus on your work instead of trying to play the hero." The classroom fell silent again, the weight of her actions hanging heavy in the air. Marcus stood there, frozen in place, the sting of her words and actions leaving him hollow. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. His classmates exchanged wide-eyed glances, some of them horrified, others too afraid to speak. Marcus's eyes welled with tears, but he refused to let them fall. He couldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. "I'm sorry, Miss Adams," he finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. He turned on his heel and walked back to his desk, his head bowed low. As Marcus sat down, the weight of humiliation settled over him like a heavy blanket. He stared at the empty desk in front of him, willing himself not to cry. But inside, his heart was breaking. The rest of the lesson dragged on, but Marcus barely heard a word. His mind was racing, filled with questions he couldn't answer. Why would she do that? What had he done wrong? At lunch, he sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, picking at his food in silence. A few classmates approached him cautiously, their faces filled with sympathy. "That was so messed up," one of them said softly. "She didn't have to do that." "Yeah," another chimed in. "It was just flowers. She didn't have to be so mean." Marcus nodded slightly but said nothing. Their words were kind, but they couldn't erase the ache in his chest. As he sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened, he couldn't shake the image of Miss Adams throwing the flowers away. It wasn't just the flowers she had crushed. It felt like she had crushed something much deeper, something he couldn't put into words. But Marcus didn't know that what happened next would change everything. By the time Marcus got home that afternoon, the weight of the day still pressed heavily on him. He dropped his backpack by the door and slumped onto the couch, his usual bright demeanor replaced with quiet sadness. His mother, Danielle, noticed immediately. "Marcus, baby, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside him and gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to upset her or seem weak, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. Finally, he whispered, "I just wanted to do something nice for Miss Adams, but she didn't like it." Danielle's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" What happened? Slowly, through choked words and the occasional tear he tried to blink away, Marcus told her everything, how he'd saved his money for the flowers, how excited he'd been to give them to his teacher, and how she had crushed them and thrown them away. Danielle's face darkened with every word. She said I shouldn't try to get attention." Marcus finished, his voice breaking. Danielle pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as her heart ached for her son. "Marcus, listen to me," she said firmly but lovingly. "You did nothing wrong. What you did was kind and thoughtful. And if she couldn't see that, it's her problem, not yours. Do you hear me?" Marcus nodded against her chest, but the hurt lingered. That night, Danielle couldn't sleep. The image of her son's crushed expression haunted her, and the thought of what Miss Adams had done filled her with anger. No child deserved to be treated like that, especially not her Marcus. The next morning, Danielle made a decision. She walked into the school office with purpose, her head held high and determination in her eyes. She asked to meet with the principal, Mr. Jenkins, and refused to leave until he made time to speak with her. When she sat down in his office, she didn't mince words. "My son Marcus brought flowers to his teacher yesterday to show his appreciation." She not only rejected them, but publicly humiliated him in front of the entire class. "This is unacceptable." Mr. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Adams is an experienced teacher. I'm sure there's been some sort of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Danielle interrupted, her voice firm. "Marcus came home heartbroken. He told me everything. She crushed the flowers and threw them in the trash. You don't humiliate a child like that, especially not one who's only trying to do something kind." The principal shifted uneasily, realizing the seriousness of the situation. "I'll address this immediately," he assured her. "I'll speak with Miss Adams personally." But Danielle wasn't done. "You need to understand something," she continued, her voice tinged with pain and frustration. "Marcus already faces enough challenges. He's a bright, loving boy who sees the good in everyone. And for someone in a position of trust to treat him like this, it's more than just cruel, it's damaging." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. "I'll handle it," he said again, more firmly this time. Later that day, Miss Adams was called into the principal's office. When confronted about her behavior, she dismissed it as teaching discipline and insisted she had done nothing wrong. "These children need to learn that life isn't always about getting praise for every little thing," she argued. But Mr. Jenkins wasn't convinced. "This wasn't about discipline," he said sternly. "This was a kind gesture from a child who looks up to you, and you crushed it. Literally." Do you have any idea what that does to a young boy's self-esteem? Miss Adams huffed, but said nothing, crossing her arms defensively. Word of the incident began to spread through the school. Students whispered about what had happened, and parents started calling the office to express their concerns. Some of Marcus's classmates told their parents how unfairly he had been treated, and soon the story reached the ears of the local community. Within days, the story was the talk of the neighborhood. Parents and teachers began questioning Miss Adams' behavior, and some even showed up at the school to demand accountability. Meanwhile, Marcus remained quiet, unsure of how to process the sudden attention. He hadn't meant to cause a stir. He just wanted to show kindness. But as the days passed, he started to notice something remarkable. His classmates, one by one, began standing up for him. "I think what Marcus did was really nice," one girl said during a class discussion. "Yeah," another boy added. "He didn't do anything wrong. Miss Adams was the one who was mean." Their support gave Marcus a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. But what happened next would change everything. For Marcus, for Miss Adams, and for the entire school. The story of Marcus and the flowers wasn't just whispered in the hallways anymore. It had become a movement. Parents, students, and even local community leaders began rallying together, appalled by how a teacher could humiliate a child for an act of kindness. A concerned parent started a social media post sharing Marcus's story, and it spread like wildfire. The post read, "A young boy brings flowers to his teacher as a thank you gesture. Instead of accepting them, she crushes them in front of the entire class. How can a child learn kindness in a world like this? We need answers." The comments poured in. "Heartbreaking. That teacher should be ashamed of herself. What kind of example does this set for our kids? Someone needs to hold her accountable." As the story gained traction, local news stations picked it up, and soon, Marcus's quiet act of kindness was being discussed on TV and social media. Reporters called it an example of how racism and cruelty can destroy a child's spirit. At school, Marcus noticed more people looking at him in the hallways. Some smiled encouragingly, while others whispered as he passed. He didn't like the attention. It made him feel small, like everyone was staring at his pain. But his mother reassured him. "Marcus, you did something brave," Danielle said one evening, kneeling in front of him. "You showed kindness in the face of someone who didn't deserve it. That's strength, not weakness. And people see that now." The support gave Danielle an idea. She reached out to the PTA, asking for a meeting to discuss Miss Adams' behavior. The room was packed the day of the meeting, with parents, teachers, and even older students eager to hear what would be said. Danielle stood at the front, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "My son was humiliated in front of his classmates for doing something kind," she began. "But this isn't just about Marcus. It's about what we're teaching our children. Are we teaching them to value kindness and compassion? Or are we teaching them to fear being themselves because they might be judged or ridiculed?" Applause erupted from the crowd, and Danielle continued. "Marcus may not fully understand this now, but what Miss Adams did wasn't just cruel. It was a reflection of her own prejudice, and it's our responsibility to make sure no other child feels the way he did that day." The principal, Mr. Jenkins, addressed the crowd next. "I've spoken with Miss Adams, and while she insists she didn't mean to cause harm, it's clear that her actions have had serious consequences. I want to assure you all that the school will be taking appropriate steps to address this." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. One parent stood up and demanded, "What does appropriate steps mean? Are you going to let her keep teaching after something like this?" Mr. Jenkins hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of the room. Before he could answer, a voice spoke from the back of the room. It was Marcus. The room went silent as he stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the sea of adults around him. His voice was soft but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you to her, that's all. I didn't mean for all of this to happen. I thought it was nice to say thank you to someone who helps you." His words hung in the air, and several people wiped tears from their eyes. Danielle placed a protective hand on his shoulder, her pride evident. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm but warm, "you don't need to apologize for being kind. Never." The meeting ended with calls for accountability. Parents demanded transparency about how the school would handle the situation. and several teachers voiced their support for creating a more inclusive and respectful learning environment. Meanwhile, the attention continued to grow. A local florist, who had heard about Marcus's story, decided to take action. They started a campaign called Flowers for Marcus and encouraged community members to bring bouquets to the school as a show of support. The following Monday, Marcus arrived at school to find the entrance overflowing with flowers. Bouquets of every size and color lined the hallways, creating a breathtaking display of solidarity. Students, parents, and even strangers had contributed, each one leaving a note of encouragement. "You're an inspiration, Marcus. Kindness always wins. Never stop being you." As Marcus walked through the hallway, his classmates cheered, and some even clapped. For the first time since the incident, he felt something other than shame. He felt proud, but the story wasn't over yet. In the face of all this support, Miss Adams would have to make a decision, one that would reveal who she truly was. The hallway filled with flowers was a sight Miss Adams couldn't avoid. When she arrived at school that Monday morning, the overwhelming display stopped her in her tracks. Students whispered as she passed, and the weight of their stares was impossible to ignore. The notes pinned to the bouquets, messages of kindness and solidarity, weren't just for Marcus. They were a silent condemnation of her actions. Miss Adams felt her chest tighten. For the first time, she began to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. She closed her classroom door and sat at her desk, staring at the stack of ungraded papers in front of her. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her mind kept returning to Marcus's face, his crushed expression as she threw away the flowers. Later that morning, the principal, Mr. Jenkins, called her into his office. His expression was firm, but there was an underlying note of disappointment in his tone. "Miss Adams, we need to talk about the incident with Marcus," he began. She nodded, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said, her voice faltering. "That may be true," Mr. Jenkins replied, "but the fact remains that your actions were hurtful and unprofessional. As educators, we have a responsibility to nurture and uplift our students, not tear them down. This incident has brought a lot of attention, not just to the school, but to your conduct. Parents are demanding accountability." Miss Adams swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "The school board has reviewed the situation," he said. "Effective immediately, you will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct further evaluations. Whether or not you return will depend on your willingness to undergo sensitivity training and prove that you're capable of fostering a respectful and inclusive classroom environment." Miss Adams wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line, and no amount of excuses could undo the harm she had caused. As she left the office, the weight of the consequences settled heavily on her shoulders. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about her actions. It was about the lasting impact they had on a child who had only wanted to show kindness. Meanwhile, Marcus began to feel the warmth of the community's support. The hallway full of flowers was just the beginning. Strangers sent him letters, local businesses offered small gifts, and even some of his classmates, who had never spoken to him before, started sitting with him at lunch. But it wasn't the attention that mattered most to Marcus. What truly stayed with him was the lesson his mother had always taught him. Kindness matters, even when it isn't returned. One afternoon, the florist who had started the Flowers for Marcus campaign invited him and his mum to the shop. When they arrived, Marcus's eyes widened at the sight of a massive arrangement of sunflowers, daisies, and tulips. "These are for you," the florist said with a warm smile. "We just wanted you to know how proud we are of you for showing kindness, even when it wasn't easy." Marcus's face lit up as he accepted the bouquet. "Thank you," he said quietly. The florist leaned down and added, "And remember, Marcus, what you did inspired a lot of people. Never stop being the kind, thoughtful boy you are." The school decided to turn the incident into a teaching moment. At the next assembly, Mr. Jenkins addressed the entire student body. "What happened in our school recently reminded us all of the importance of kindness and respect," he said. "Marcus taught us that small acts of kindness can make a big difference. And he also taught us that standing up against wrong is just as important." As Marcus sat in the front row, surrounded by his classmates, he felt a swell of pride. For the first time, he truly believed that his actions mattered. Miss Adams' absence was noticeable, And though Marcus never wished harm upon her, he hoped that wherever she was, she had learned something too. In the weeks that followed, the school implemented new policies aimed at fostering a more inclusive and supportive environment. Teachers underwent training, and students were encouraged to participate in activities that promoted empathy and kindness. For Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. One where he felt seen and valued, not just by his classmates, but by the entire community. And though he still missed the simplicity of just being a kid, he knew that what he had gone through had made him stronger. As he walked through the halls one day, a younger student stopped him and said, "I think what you did was really brave." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with quiet pride. "Thanks," he said simply. And in that moment, he realized that even though Miss Adams had crushed the flowers, she hadn't crushed his spirit.